had a servant, and the servant's name was Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was desperately sad. He was extremely sad because he had just gotten word that some things had gone wrong with his homeland. And so Nehemiah was very sad, and he was then in the presence of the king, and the king started to see that Nehemiah was sad. Well, Nehemiah was so sad because this land that was part of their family and part of their ancestry for so long, it had been in disrepair for a while, for a long time, and people had actually gone back to try to fix the land. They tried to rebuild the walls, they tried to rebuild the gates of the city, they tried to bring it back to safety and glory, and it wasn't happening. And so Nehemiah hears about this, and he's just sad over this, because this is just like his family land. This is the spot where his ancestors grew up, and he heard the stories about this place, and he thought, well, that can't be. I can't let that happen. So when he was with the king saw that he was sad, and so the king actually asked him, why are you so sad? And Nehemiah told him about his homeland and all these things. And Nehemiah, who's just a servant of the king, and who's a different faith than this king, is thinking, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm just telling the king. And it turns out that the king is gracious, and the king is kind. And the king says, well, then you need to go to your homeland, and you need to help them. So the king gave Nehemiah people to go with him, gave him resources to help him along the way, even gave him letters of endorsement to help him get across all the other countries in order to get to his homeland. And Nehemiah realized, God is with me. And Nehemiah realized that this was where God was leading him to go. So Nehemiah left on his journey. Well, it was a good thing, too, that Nehemiah was a pretty crafty guy, because he had to work with some challenging people. There were people in his homeland, once he got there, who were not very excited about what was going on. Nehemiah was excited about the new things that were going to happen, but all these other people, they weren't, because nothing was going right. And he had to silence the opposition, and he had to work with all these people who disagreed. But this was Nehemiah, and he was able to work through this. He was able to help people, as a good project manager should, come in ahead of schedule and under budget to be able to complete the walls and the gates and everything. And they did. They rebuilt the walls, they rebuilt the gates, and it was even beautiful. And so people had this sense of satisfaction, about what they had done. And it was a good sense of satisfaction, because they'd done something, it was productive, and they felt good about what they'd been able to do together. So once this happened, Nehemiah then gathered all the people together in the city. And this is thousands of people that he gathered together. And he brought them all together in what was some sort of a town square or a gathering place in the middle of the city. And then he called on a man named Ezra. Now Ezra had a good reputation. He was somebody who everybody knew, and he was somebody who knew God. He knew the history of these people's faith, and he knew something about God. So he called on Ezra, and Ezra came up to a podium that had been specially built for this occasion. And it was built so that Ezra and this other group of people could come up to this podium and this place where everybody gathered together could see them because they were up higher. And when Ezra came up, he took out the Bible. Now for them, their Bible was a little different than ours. Theirs was a little shorter. They didn't have all that we have, but theirs was big because it was a scroll and it was handwritten. And so when he took the scroll and laid it on this podium, it was big. And that's when the people got quiet. And Ezra started to read. And he read from their Bible. And the people were glued. And they listened. And then once he was done reading, all the teachers helped people understand what it was that was being read. Because these people had not heard this Bible. They had not heard it in ages. In fact, some of them had never heard it. They'd heard about it from their family and their ancestors, but they had never actually heard it read. So they wanted to know what it was about. And these teachers went through all the passages, and they taught them what all these things meant. The things that God had done in the past, the things that people had done in relation back to God, and all the things that were happening. These teachers taught the people what was going on in their Bible. And so they learned what it was about and what God was doing and what the people were doing too. So in response to this, what did everybody do? Well, they did a lot. The first thing they did is they felt awful. I mean, they felt terrible. And they felt terrible because they heard all these stories about their ancestors and all the disobedience and all the failures and all the things they did wrong in God's sight. And the people thought, wait, that's my family. I don't want to be part of that family. That hurts, and that's me, and that's part of my lineage. I don't want to be part of that. And so they felt awful. And so when Nehemiah sees that the people are feeling awful and sad, he says, no, do not feel awful. Because he was reminding them that God was with them. So in that moment, he coined the phrase, the joy of the Lord is your strength. So Nehemiah says, don't be sad, because the joy of the Lord is your strength. So he said, let's celebrate. So they had parties and they celebrated in lavish ways. And then the people realized, as they kept reading the Bible through these celebrations, they realized that God actually told them to celebrate. And God appointed all these celebrations and these feasts and these festivals that we have in our Bible, and we've looked at those. And so they realized, oh my goodness, people in the past have celebrated in big ways. We can celebrate too. So they started celebrating one feast in particular, and as they did, somebody was reading them the Bible every day. So they were getting a lot of Bible. Well, as they continued to hear the Bible read, something else happened. One day, they heard the Bible read for 3 hours straight. And then they confessed their sin for 3 hours more. They were driven to confess their sin because they thought, wait, I'm just not worthy of this God who's in my life. So after they confessed and after they heard the Bible being read more and more and more, the leaders then spontaneously broke out in a prayer. And it's a very long prayer because it was recounting all the things that God had done all the way in the past. God created the world. People fell away. God rescued people. God established relationships with people. I mean, they went through the entire history that they had of God's people up to that point. And then their prayer got up to the point of the present, of them. And these leaders then prayed for each other and for their community and for all the people gathered. And they said, God, we need your help. And we want a relationship with you. And the prayer included themselves. Well, after they finished the prayer, they kept on responding to this Bible that they read and they keep hearing being read. And they responded by all getting together in this unified, together kind of way. And they actually wrote a document. And it was a document like an oath or like a promise or like some sort of document to seal their faith. And so they wrote this whole thing out. And it was a document that said, we want to follow you, God. We together, we commit to the faith that we have in you. And we want to follow you obediently. Unlike some of the people in our family past, but we want to be faithful. And so they wrote this thing, and they signed this thing. People actually signed it with their names. And this was a declaration in that moment that they wanted to do something new in their faith. And all this came from reading the Bible. They got something significant out of reading the Bible. Because the Bible just isn't a book. The Bible isn't just information. It's not just a collection of stories. It's not just biographies about great people. The Bible's more than that. And the people discovered that it was more than that. They found that the Bible is the big picture. It's their big picture. And the more stories they read and they heard, they realized that they were part of this big picture that God was painting for them. See, Nehemiah and his people, when they read their Bible, they were picturing themselves in the middle of this. Because up until the time Ezra came out and read the Bible, they were thinking, well, we're a great community of people who've done a great thing, and we've rebuilt these walls, and we've rebuilt these gates, and it's a magnificent thing, and it's valuable for our family. We need to do this because it's our land. But then once Ezra read from the Bible, and they realized that they were part of that story, their picture got bigger. Because they realized they weren't just doing something great and important for themselves. They were doing something that was part of God's plan. And they realized they're part of God's big picture. I love the Bible because the Bible is our big picture. When we went to went on a road trip to Colorado when William was 2 and Madeline was not yet, we took a long drive to Colorado. Some friends had offered for us to stay in their house for a few days, and we had never spent any time there, and they allowed us to take our extended family. So we did, and all 9 of us piled in a couple cars, and we road tripped out to Colorado. We arrived there on the 4th of July in the evening, and we had to find dinner, so we found dinner downtown. And then somebody told us that we had to stay for the 4th of July fireworks show, and this was in Durango. So we decided, well, let's find our spot, and let's watch the fireworks show, which we did, and it was a great show. But afterward, it was quite dark. And this home that we were staying in, which we had not yet been to, it was not in the city, it was outside, it was kind of a ranch outside of town, and so we had to find the ranch. Well, they told us that you cannot use your GPS because it won't get you there. You have to follow the written instructions. So we did, and after a while we wound around in what felt like nowhere, and we finally found this place. And we all, after a long drive, unpacked our bags and walked inside, turned on the lights, and explored all the rooms to figure out who was going to sleep where and how to get around this house. So we did, and we explored all the rooms, and we got to peek in everything, and then we finally settled in to find which room we were going to sleep in. Well, at that point, we knew the house, and we knew the front driveway where we parked, and we went out on the back patio, and we could just see the patio, and that was about it. So we went to bed because we were tired. Well, the next morning, the sun woke us up, and we'd seen the house, and we'd seen all the rooms, so we wanted to see something else, and we opened up the back door, and what we could only see before as the patio was now hundreds of acres of pasture land, and there were horses, and there was a creek running down from some pine trees across this meadow. I mean, it was like these places you see, you think, how is this possible? I mean, this was beautiful. And that morning, we saw the big picture. Because the night before, we couldn't see any of it. And now we saw the big picture. And I love the Bible because the Bible is our big picture. It's a chance for us to be opened up into this vast vision that God has for our lives, and the plans that God has for us, and how we fit into God's greater design. Because when we're included in the Bible, our picture gets so much bigger. And the Bible is so much bigger than us, but it lets us in. The Bible is older than us, but we are part of its story. The Bible welcomes us into God's picture and God's story. And it was when some of us realized that RiverCross Church was part of God's picture, that's when the church started to happen. And we've heard some of this before, but I'm reminded of this, and it's one of the first things I thought of when I thought of the Bible as the big picture. Because I remember very vividly that we were all meeting together, and we were all talking, and we were all planning and trying to organize and come up with the right model and the right fit and the right way for whatever this church was going to be, and we couldn't quite figure it out. And for at least Kimberly and me, we were not convinced that this was all fitting together yet. It just didn't quite make sense until we read Joshua chapter 3. And that's the story of these several thousand people, or hundreds of thousands of people, being at the banks of the Jordan River, looking across to the place that God promised them, and they just couldn't get there until God showed up and stopped the waters so that the people could walk across. And when we read that, we realized, wait a minute, that's us. Because we know that there's something out there like a church, but we don't know how to get there. And then God showed up, and God said, you're part of my story. And once we realize that we're part of God's story, then we realize how we can live in God's presence and in God's direction and in God's grace. And RiverCross Church was born. I love the Bible because the Bible is the big picture for our lives. So that's all introduction. And no, that doesn't mean there's 4 hours more of sermon. It just means that's all introduction. Because for the next year, for this year, we are going to be looking through this Bible that is the big picture. And some of us have read through the entire Bible before. Some of us have done it recently. We've done it as a family. Some of us have done that. So we're going to do it a little differently. Because you can't do the same thing the same way all the time. You got to do it differently. So we're going to do a few things differently as we look through this big picture. Because one thing that happens when we read through the Bible, verse by verse and chapter by chapter, is that we kind of get drowned. It's easy to just get drowned in, oh my goodness, there's so much happening, and this book is so long, and what did I just read? So we're going to try to find the big picture the whole time as we read through. Now, if you'd like to read the entire Bible during this year, go wild. You'll just have to maybe filter a little more because there's so much there. But what we're going to be doing is something called the 180 plan. And I hope what the 180 plan does is it causes us to do a 180 in our view maybe of God or some presumptions we have about our faith. And the 180 plan is 180 readings, one chapter per reading. If you do the math, that's about every other day, one chapter every other day. 180 chapters in the Bible is about 10% of the Bible. And that 10% will give us the big picture of who God is and of God's work. So at a minimum, I hope you might give it a shot to read the 180 plan. And we have details about this, so don't worry. We'll have a plan. The other thing that we also have is that we have an opportunity not only to just read the big picture, but to let it sit with us and hopefully stay with us. There are 52 choice Bible verses that we have a list of to encourage all of us to memorize. 52 verses. That would be one, how often? A week. One verse per week. And let me just say, we did not choose the longest verse in the Bible. We chose some of the shortest verses in the Bible, and they're some of the best verses. That, if you put these together, they capture the big picture of who God is and what God has done. So 52 verses to memorize that capture the big picture. Kids also get an extra bonus. So if you want to join the kids during their connection time, they are going to survey the entire Bible through weekly stories. Oftentimes they will match up with what we're doing during the worship service. In fact, most of the time they do. Not quite always. Most of the time. They get to survey the entire Bible, and so they get a double portion of all these good stories and these good things. So that curriculum is going to start next week, and so they're going to get some great things. Kids, you do have a connection time this week too. But that curriculum starts next week. And then, if we want to even take one more step further, because we got to do things a little differently, is we're going to try something out called Rewind. And we're going to call it Rewind because on Thursday of each week, we will publish a very short video, and it's a video recap about what's happened the previous week to get ready for the next week. So if you want, on Thursday or Friday or Saturday or on your way to church on Sunday, I know how we roll, you can watch that short video in preparation for the next week. So you feel like you're up to speed and that there's some continuity and some connection. Now you'll find that on our YouTube page, and you can find that by subscribing to our YouTube channel or just going there all the time. Now, all these nifty details are in these little packets that are in a basket on the back table, and you will find in there a 180-day reading plan. You'll find the 52 memory verses. You'll find a rewind card that gives you some information about how to find the rewind videos. And then you'll find an extra little fun activity for those of you that just like fun activities. So pick one up, one per family if you wouldn't mind, and we'll see how many we have extra, and we'll even mail some out to people who didn't get a chance to be here today so they are up to speed on things. My hope through all this, and we'll maybe even create some more things along the way, but my hope is that we all, for the first time, or maybe again for the first time, we discover the big picture of who God is and what our faith looks like in this God. So, can I pray for us and for this year?